Nick, thank you for your time. Thank you for showing up on this amazing show, Interpersonal Neurobiology. And yeah, this is, of course, my first interview with anyone in the world in terms of being on the social media platform. And Nick is an integrative health practitioner with training and education across a wide variety of disciplines in health and wellness. These include neuroscience and functional neurology, integrative and functional medicine, kinesiology and mind and body medicine, vagus nerve therapy, neuromuscular therapy, movement therapy, and personal training. In addition to being a practitioner, Nick has been a clinical educator for the last 6 years, teaching practitioners on both entry-level and professional development education. He has developed nationally accredited, accredited training in sports therapy and neurological approaches to rehabilitation and mentored many different types of practitioners worldwide. That's incredible. In his clinical background, Nick has extensive experience working with a range of conditions such as mental health, including anxiety, PTSD, and depression, neurological health, such as traumatic brain injury, fibromyalgia, Parkinson, stroke, and autism, and over 13 years experience with musculoskeletal conditions such as back pain, sport injury, and common postural or movement dysfunction. And Nick, thank you for joining us today. And today we'll be talking about childhood development impact our response to trauma.
Yeah.
And yeah, Nick, tell us what you know about this.
What do I know about this? A few different things. Right off the bat, if anyone has any specific questions they want to know, you can just start firing them away. What do we know about the childhood development and impacts brain response to trauma? Well, essentially, everything that happens from the moment of conception through gestation in mama's belly and into the first few years of life, what happens in sequence in those times is actually hugely important in setting up a foundation for our neurology to be able to withstand the rigors and the stresses of life. So this starts, it's a combination of, say, genetics, our genetic profile, so what we inherited from our parents, which has somewhat of an impact on how we're going to come out into the world. So that's more like what we're imprinted with, and we can sometimes inherit psychological traumas from generations back. This is now known to be true, and it's been well researched. So we're not even born with a clean slate. We're born with genetic imprinting of certain traumas right from the moment we're in the womb. So, and in the womb and through gestation, it's now been shown that everything that that happens around us while we're in the womb we can actually hear that, we can experience that. Our nervous system is still actually active then. Our vestibular system, our inner ear system, because we're suspended in the amniotic fluid in mama's belly, our vestibular system is providing all this input. We still can hear, and we can sort of somewhat see. Our brain is really decoding signals from the environment. From as soon as we start to grow, and our brain starts to embryologically grow. So everything that we are around can potentially have a positive or a negative impact on our psychological development. So that's pretty big stuff. So like some positive things that could happen potentially. Myself and my partner, with my daughter, what we didn't know whether she was going to be a boy or a girl, but what we did is we essentially we talked to the baby all the time, and if there was things that were stressful, we still talked to the little one. And we also understood, you know, we could feel, I remember sometimes we went and saw a war movie. Remember that movie Dunkirk that was released a few years ago? Essentially, when we were sitting in the audience, we could, you know, my partner remarked that the little one was, you know, moving around a lot. So obviously, little one was already responding to stress from, you know, the environment, the noisy environment around that time. So yeah, who knows how much effect that had on the child, but these are all little things we've got to look at. And so then that all happens, and then we have birth, and birth itself is a trauma, a massive trauma for not only the mother, but the child and the father as well in a different way. But it's a huge trauma. And so when that happens, as soon as the child comes out, you know, what's these things called primitive reflexes, and the primitive reflexes are essentially neonatal survival reflexes. So again, everything's automatic. Everything is built in. It's reflexive and automatic. You know, it's all loaded into our brainstem. We have no higher cortical function whatsoever. We can't really cognate. We can't think. But when we come out of the birth canal, we've got one of these primitive reflexes called the ATNR, the asymmetric tonic neck writing reflex, and that starts to move us out of the birth canal and out. And then once we finally come out into the world, we stop breathing amniotic fluid or whatever that we ingest when we're in the womb, and then we take our first breath. And when we do that, our Moro reflex, which is our startle reflex, which is initiated in the brainstem of the medulla, initiates a big cry, and they start to cry. So when you hear the baby cry, that's a really good thing, and that's actually our first breath. Our first breath. It's a big and a wah and a cry. Yeah. Okay, so that's the Moro reflex. That's the startle reflex, and that reflex is present only for the first 2 to 4 months of life.
Okay.
So it shouldn't be there after 4 months. Okay, so we know this when you know, it's why we wrap them up, right? We wrap them up in these little what are they called again? Yeah. Straddles. That's it. Because if you swaddle, that's it. Because if they don't, when they hear a loud noise or, you know, something like that, they go bang, and then they initiate this reflex, and then they'll start crying, because to the immature brain, this movement, noise initiates this movement, and this movement initiates a cry. Okay, and the cry is a reflex pattern from the infant to try and call for mum. And if mum doesn't come, there goes our first signs of attachment theory, essentially. So we start to lose. It's like we're a little infant. We don't know anything. We don't know anything about the world. We need mama and dada to help us. And if we initiate a survival cry and mama doesn't come for us, then we start to try and compensate for that. So we'll either try and cry more, or we'll stop crying. And both are not good responses. And both tie back into either a sympathetic response or a dorsal vagal response, which is something we can touch on later when we're talking about a 3-tiered response to stress. But yeah, so we have the Moro reflex. That's related to fear. The emotion is related to it is actually fear, and that should not be present from 4 months old. Okay, what happens is that it gets inhibited by higher functions in the nervous system, and so we can perform more complex tasks. So this is a very gross movement. Yeah. So then the developing nervous system realizes that it basically can now progress forward, and so it inhibits and shuts down that reflex, and therefore you can start to progress into more complex tasks, both from a physical level and a psychological level. So if you see, if you know any adults, and I'm sure everyone knows one or two, and you might be this person yourself, and they're in a room and a door just slams really loudly, and they go, oh, like that, they go bang, like that, and then they freak out, like, or they shut down or something. Sometimes that's actually the Moro reflex, which is still present as an adult. So, you can have like 50-year-old people who have this reflex, which shouldn't have been there for 50 odd years. So what's actually happened to a person like that is that on a parts of their psychology is really primitive, and it's almost like their brain is still operating at an infant level in regards to processing large amounts of stimuli. Okay, so this can severely hamper their ability to withstand stress. Okay, so we can't avoid stress, and stress is not always a bad thing. You know, I just did a post before on good stress, hormetic stress, and then we've got chronic stress. So chronic stress is not good. Like, it's going to lead to illness, and, you know, potentially death down the track. But you need to be able to respond to stress. And so if one of these primitive reflexes, especially that reflex, is still active as an adult, it holds you back in your ability to process stress and trauma. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So how does the primitive reflex inhibit ability to respond to stress properly in adults?
Well, because it's such a reflexive, what we call subcortical, it happens underneath conscious awareness before you can even think about it. Most of their reactions are very reflexive, so there's not enough time for them to sort of realize that it's just a door slamming and it's not someone shooting you. But for them, because that reflex is so active and their nervous system is so attuned to watching out for threats, when it happens,
interesting,
and it keeps on happening, it just drives into the system that they have a very primitive response to stress. Okay, so in response to stress or stimuli, threatening stimuli, we have one of three responses. So, and this is from the most base levels, we'll go into like a freeze response, which is to do with the dorsal portion or the rear portion of the vagus nerve in the neck up here, and that's part of the medulla. And that will shut down. And there's a part of the Moro reflex, which is more like, it's like fear paralysis reflex, essentially. They'll shut down and they'll close off and almost disassociate to the stimuli. But the stimuli has to be really either really high, really life-threatening, or they could have potentially one of these retained reflexes there. So they're more likely to perceive what you and I would perceive as a little bit scary, but for them it's like life-threatening. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So therefore,
so what is the Moro reflex? What is the Moro reflex? Is it Moro? M-O-R-A-L?
M-O-R-O. So it's essentially
M-O-R-O.
called the startle reflex. So it's initiated by usually sound is the big one. So any sharp or high or low sounds that are coming into the ears, or it can even be changes in elevation. So vestibular input. So that's your position of your head in space. So if they drop suddenly, that can initiate the reflex. It can also be things coming in through your peripheral vision very fast, because remember, this is the part of your brain which is always searching for predators. And it can also even be a smell. So it could be, like for instance, a smell that your brain associates as something threatening. If we use an example, for instance, if you had like sexual trauma or something like that, and there was a certain smell in the room. We know this with emotions anyway. Potentially, the smell itself could actually trigger an emotional response. And so, with the Moro reflex, it's basically all those four sensory inputs can, if it's deemed threatening by your nervous system, then that reflex will fire up, and then it will create a whole cascade of responses. It will usually shut you down, or it will either shut you down or fire you right up, depending on who you are. But if that's initiated over time, it's very detrimental to your whole autonomic nervous system, even to your immune system, and just to your overall ability to think through problems and process stress. That doesn't always affect every part of your life, and with every person's individual as well. Some people have very active, some people have mildly active, and most people are okay. So, but it's something that I always have to look at with people, because I often find correlations with people who have been in lots of, like, they've had chronic pain, or they have neurological conditions, or they've had trauma, like severe trauma, traumatic brain injuries and stuff like that. And this reflex has been in their life. So they've either never retained it, they've never integrated it into their nervous system, so their whole life they've been without it. But there are certain instances where something can happen in your life, like severe life threat, or a stroke, or a traumatic brain injury, or something like that, which can actually bring this reflex back out and back to the surface. So you could have had a normal childhood, but something really big happened, and then it brings it back out, and it's sort of almost what it does neurologically is it takes you back in time, and so you're back into a more primitive response to threatening stimuli. Does that make sense?
So things like, people who are very reactive, that they cannot control themselves. Even after being overly reactive, they can't even self-reflect to notice what they just did. Is that part of their?
Yes, sort of, yeah. Like, so yes, I know. So it depends. Like, so someone could freeze, and if they freeze, they dissociate. So they've almost like nothing. They almost can't react to anything. They need to mobilize. But then you've got the overreactors you're talking about, and they're more into like they're actually overactive sympathetically, and they're super reactive. Still, it's happening underneath the conscious awareness. They're so heightened that they can't, process what's just happened, and usually it tends to be stuck in a victim mode as well. So what's actually happening with them is they're on switch, Whereas with the Moro, can either, depending on who you are, can flip you right off into life threat mode, or it can flip you super high. Okay. So with the body, it's just, there's a lot of nuance to it. There's a lot of nuance to it with the nervous system. It's all very individualized as well, and it's
Absolutely.
all based off nurture, nature and nurture. Genetic profile, your environment growing up, and then also have you had experiences which have helped you grow. So there's lots of different things that factor into why someone would have it or wouldn't, and how quickly someone can either overcome it or develop more mental and emotional resiliency. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So how those your proprioception, your interoception, and how does those are they part of the primitive reflexes, or how do they factor into how we respond to trauma?
No, interoception. It definitely is all linked in. Everything, we have to think, everything always links in together. But interoception is the sense of what's happening inside us, within us.
Yeah.
So there are certain receptors called interoceptors. Well, they're not really called interoceptors. Interoception is the sense, but there are certain receptors that sense what's happening in your viscera, in your heart and lungs, and in your organ system. And even in your emotional system as well, but they also have areas on the skin. So they're essentially monitoring you all the time on both a physical and a psychological level. So it does, in a sense, relate back to the reflexes or developmental responses, because what can actually happen is that a lot of times people have, so they say 80% of your dysfunctions from a neurological level are coming from faulty or unintegrated interoceptive feedback from the inside of your body to your brain. And 80% of what your brain's paying attention to is interoception. So essentially it's the information coming into the brain from the body, right? So if there's basically a disconnect there, like for instance in reflexes, retained reflexes, sometimes they're not just reacting to what's happening in the external environment, they're actually reacting to what's happening in their own internal environment. So when it comes to emotions, right, people think it's because that person did this to me, but usually, for instance, I'm afraid of, I don't like that person. It's what's actually happening there is that you're reacting to the feeling that you feel when you see that person, right? So you're reacting to the interoceptive feedback that you're feeling when in that person, that stimuli that you feel is not pleasant. So you react to that, but you think, because we always tend to be outwardly focused, that you're reacting in response to that person, right? And that person is a threat, and they're just basically triggering something that's within you. Does that make sense? It's
Yeah.
a different way of looking at things, but it's actually how the body works. So even with working with chronic pain and stuff like that, a lot of it is just working with the interoceptive system. So getting the brain to be able to see the body better. So the brain,
Getting the brain to see the body better.
Yes. So the body can feel safer, and if the body feels safer, the mind feels safer. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So
makes
a lot
sense.
of people with anxiety, trauma, PTSD, stuff like that, they are feeling, it's all about safety. It's all about safety. Yeah. And they've either had like instances they've had they've had stuff that happened in their childhood, gestation, birth traumas, stuff like that, or they've just had a series of events. Okay. But I see it so many times. They basically need to be able to connect into their own body and actually feel what's happening in there rather than actually reacting to it. But at the end of the day, if it's so much of a threat to them, we need to have strategies, which is some of the stuff I do in clinic, to be able to to help their brain see the body better. So vagus nerve therapy, for instance, the vagus nerve's role, from a physiological sense, the vagus nerve's role, it's 80% sensory, which means that its job is to integrate all the input coming up from the viscera and see what's happening. This is all happening way underneath the surface, yeah? And if it can see what's happening, then the body's in a relative homeostasis, which is a balance. And the more balanced your body is, the more balanced your mind can be, if that makes sense. So, yeah, breathing is another way to do it, like deep breathing. Any input can really help it. Emotional release therapies and stuff like that. Working on your organs, so the visceral manipulation, I do a bit of that where I work on the organs of people.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's a direct way of improving interoceptive.
So that improves. So you said earlier that the brain need to perceive the body better. So are you talking about the organs communicating information to the brain?
All the time. It's happening all the time. So I always have this saying of, say, 95% of what your existence, right, is a reflex. It's reflexive, meaning it's happening all underneath the conscious awareness. And maybe we can develop more conscious awareness of that, and that's what they say, really highly developed yogis are. They're people who have been able to slow their conscious mind down enough to be able to tap into these somewhat subconscious operating systems. But this is, this is all to do with, this is how we work. This is always how we work. With posture and movement, it's the same thing. Like, you don't think about how to relax all these muscles on and off. Your body just does it. Yeah. But we have to just go back to basics. Like, what's your brain? What is it trying to do? It's actually, its main directive is to keep you alive, and that's it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so any threats to that over time, they accumulate, and you can actually formulate an entire personality off, subconsciously off your brain's desire to remain safe. Yeah.
Yeah. So how does the organs? I don't want to miss that. You mentioned the fact that you work with your client in terms around their organs. So is that to improve the communication to the brain? Why does the brain need to perceive these organs' messages?
So it can correct itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what stops it in the first place from perceiving? What blocks it from perceiving information from its organ? Sorry?
Many things. So if we're thinking about an organ, right, it depends on the organ. So like if it's the liver, right? The liver organ is very like any psycho-emotional stress impacts the liver. And especially the emotions of anger, but it's also the major detox organ of the body. So if you're eating really shit foods and you are, drinking a lot and you're smoking and stuff like that, it's having to work a lot harder to be able to detox from the body. So it's not going to be able to, either the feedback is going to be really poor into the brain, And you know what I mean? So essentially what the brain is always trying to see is, can it see everything? Can it see you all the time? You know, it's trying to know where you are. We have to think of the brain as like it's stuck in a black hole, and it only knows where you are and how safe you are by the information coming into it. Yeah, does that mean? So if we can improve the information coming into it by sometimes reminding it where it is, where this organ is, or that's why movement's so powerful, because it's all proprioceptive input back up into the brain. And when the brain's
what do you
getting
mean by proprioceptive?
input, huh?
What do you mean by proprioceptive?
Well, so proprioceptive is basically that your body's perception of where you are in space. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, so all throughout our body, both inside and outside, we have proprioceptors, and they're sensing where our tissues are in space, and that's about 70% of the input back into the brain. And so there has been even research into people with anxiety, right? And if they start doing really slow mobility work, which gives a lot of proprioceptive input back into the brain, their anxiety reduces. So I thought that was pretty cool, because again, it's all about sending feedback into this mechanism here, which the brain is not the be all and end all, but the brain is the controller mechanism, and it's always trying to keep you safe. You just have to remember that. We have the gut brain as well. We have the heart brain as well. So the heart brain is probably the most important, and it has the widest electromagnetic field, right? And there's research on that saying that I first came across this research about 10 years ago, but the heart's electromagnetic field can perceive what's going to happen around 5 seconds before it happens. Then it sends information back up through the vagus nerve pathways into the brain, which then sends information back down the vagus nerve into the gut. This is all happening all the time. Boom.
Incredible.
So, yeah. So the brain's the organizer, the heart knows everything, and the gut is telling you, oi, pay attention. Yeah, but it's also, there's a lot of stuff happening in the gut we know as well. There's serotonin and everything built in there. So, yeah, there's a million ways we can explain all this sort of stuff. But the three main ways the brain likes to see itself, or four main ways, is input from the eyes, input from the middle ear, input from the proprioceptors, and input from inside the body. If that's all good, then it generally feels safer. And if it feels safer, then it generally works better. And if it works better, then your mind is in a better spot to be able to process anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. To function, to think properly, to work through complex tasks, to, like a lot of people can't actually work through trauma because their physiology is not set up to do that. So they don't have the resources in their body.
Sorry, can you say that again?
So this is why a lot of people struggle with releasing trauma or something like that, stuff like that, is because sometimes their body, and it could be related to development, but their body doesn't have enough resources. It's not working correctly. They're not ready to actually let something go. And it's actually, in some cases, it would be detrimental for that person to release release their emotions or trauma through whatever therapy you're doing. There's many therapies that do this, but sometimes if you go too quickly and their body's not set up for it, and their nervous system isn't integrated enough to be able to do it, then it's going to be bad. It's not going to be fun for them anyway, and they're going to have a bit of a healing crisis. So, yeah, when I'm working with this sort of stuff in clinic, I'm essentially asking their body, is there a permission to release this trauma? Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, and because for me to say, I can just push you through something, that's more about me than it is about the client. And when I'm working with someone through this sort of stuff, it's always client-centered, it's client-focused, and there's very much an art to it, as well as lots of science. It's very much an art, and it's about finding, like one of the other sayings I like is, the success of any therapy depends on the basis of the problem. So if, for instance, the success of any therapy depends on the basis of the problem. So if you're working with someone who has, say, trauma, and they're just working through cognitive behavioral therapy or talk therapy, which can be fantastic in certain ways, but their nervous system is in this either freeze response or fight flight response, and maybe they have some reflexes on, say, the Moro, they could go see the best talk therapist in the world. But if it's the Moro reflex or something else that's more primitive driving their traumatic responses and their anxiety, it's not gonna work. It just can't, because it's the root of the problem is not being addressed. So this is why we always have to look at people really, really holistically. We have to appreciate their biology. Yeah. So you and I have a very similar biology. You and I, in response to stress, we're all going to respond in one of three ways. We're either going to freeze, we're going to fight flight, or we're going to react to the stress and calmly be able to still engage our frontal mind and work through it. Yeah. Yeah. And then people think I'm always stuck in one response or another. You generally have more of a default response, but we can oscillate too. Like there are times where I still have triggers as well, like where I can go, get really agitated. But most of the time I'm pretty calm. People think I'm stuck there. You're not stuck there. We need to get you to a point to basically, everyone needs to be in what's called this socially engaged state, social engagement system, and that is the highest function I was talking about there, which is basically related to the ventral portion of the vagus nerve. Yeah. That is, again, directed at the bottom of the brain. But if this is on, it means that we can actually process stress or stressful stimuli in a measured way. Yeah. In a measured way. Yeah. That's ideally where we want to be. Yeah. That's ideally where we want to be. Sympathetic nervous system fight flight, over time is, say 20, 30 years of it, if that's where you're living in, it's going to cause health problems, like not just psychological problems, but usually physiological problems, such as all sorts of neurological or immune-related disorders, and that's pretty much what my clinic is filled with. Yeah. So
interesting. So, what about people who are how would you explain somebody who have a dissociative disorder, whether from the age of 5 or age of 7 up till adulthood, and they are on the far end of the trauma disorder spectrum, where they are exhibiting, psychopathological traits. So how would you describe their physiology? What happened to their organs and their proprioception and interoception? And is their brain, I'm very sure their brain is not receiving any information from their body, from the organ. So how would you help that kind of person in, when they come to your clinic from the body, biology, bottom-up place?
So someone like that, so dissociative?
Disorder.
What would they be?
What would it be like in their body?
Like as in like dissociative in response to stress? Like
yes.
Shut down?
Yeah.
They're shut down towards it. They're not psychopathic, because this is different, psychopath and dissociative. So which one?
That's very correct. But they've gone from being dissociative to exhibiting, a bit of
antisocial behavior.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, again, the way I never ever treat the condition. So I look at the condition, which has a pathophysiology, but then I treat the person, and then we go back in time, and we go back to the beginning. And for instance, there could be a multitude of reasons why that person ended up in that state, and I would go back to the first thing, if I could, and try to eradicate that stressor from the nervous system, or set up an environment. Someone like that, if they walked into my clinic, I'd whack them straight onto doing vagus nerve stimulation for a period of months. So vagus nerve stimulation has been, so people like that, they have lower, they have more excitatory neurotransmitters and low inhibitory neurotransmitters. So inhibitory neurotransmitters keep us calmer, and excitatory neurotransmitters obviously keep us up. Yeah. And those types of people, and schizophrenics and stuff like that, they're deficient in dopamine, and they're higher in cortisol, and they're higher in adrenaline, and all that sort of stuff. So it's
Absolutely.
really about balancing the neurotransmitters. So there's many
Absolutely.
ways we can do that. Many ways you can do that. Like, I just know in my clinic, I've got vagus nerve stimulation. I know if I do vagus nerve stimulation over a period of time, their brain is going to start to release, just by stimulating the nerve, stimulating the brain, their brain is going to start to release dopamine naturally, and GABA, which is another calming neurotransmitter naturally. And as those levels rise up, then their stress hormones rise down and they become balanced. So that their physiology is being treated to be able to support changes in their psychology.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah. But there's many ways we can do that. Like, so for instance, I can modulate your neurotransmitters right now, but if I'm speaking really fast, you're gonna secrete more, excitatory neurotransmitters. But if I'm working with someone who's in trauma, I generally am speaking slower, and I'm making sure I have eye contact all the time, because if I'm looking into their eyes, then I'm not looking away, and they can gauge from my eyes whether I'm safe or not. So I can actually start to modulate, and we all do this naturally. Every human does this. Yeah, because they're trying to pick up cues from my face. Am I a threat or not? So there's many different ways you can do it. You can do it through body work. You can do it through, some somatic sort of release work, somatic experiencing. You can do it through initiating neurogenic tremors. So even in that case with that person you're talking about, I would want to create an environment where they didn't need to be in this mode of severe, the world is against me. That's how they essentially probably developed. And all of it is doing the same thing. It's improving the brain's perception and awareness of the body, and integrate. It's all about integration. It's integrating everything together. Yeah. If you have an integrated brain, you process life a lot better and you perform a lot higher. Yeah. If your brain is disintegrated, what's the main thing that's going to disintegrate your brain? Stress, chronic stress.
Hey.
Chronic stress and trauma, and repeated traumas, they just compound each other. So is it starting to make sense, hopefully?
Yeah,
it's still really simple. It's just basically they've got a bucket of stress and people can only handle a certain bucket limit, and then it starts spilling over and they start getting symptoms. And I essentially do is try to remove things out of the bucket. Yeah.
Indeed.
And when you remove things out of the bucket, the body itself does the healing. The body is the healer. Yeah, the body is the healer. Then the body supports the mind. Yeah, we have to remember that. Like, I work with a lot of physical, structural conditions with movement disorders and stuff like that. The body is the healer. Yeah, so with all the tools that I use is basically tapping into the body's, essentially making the body work better for itself. Essentially, creating. It's a self-organizing system. Yeah, until it's not, and then when it's not, it's things just go downhill. So we can't always think. We try to think our way out of everything. So for instance, we're going back to childhood development. If you've had a disruptive childhood and you've had repeated traumas, and you've modeled your modeled behavior of people that shouldn't really be modeled, then that's going to have a detrimental. That's all going to be part of the tapestry of you when you start to try and unwind these traumas. But you can't often think it away. You have to then. There has to be some level of letting go, working from a neurological level, working from a somatic experiencing level, and sometimes doing some stuff that just blows your mind.
Incredible. Yeah. So my next question is, I think I'm going to repeat the same question. Is like, if somebody like that, I know when you say that you will stimulate their vagus nerve stimulation, how do you do that? Okay. How do you do that in a clinical?
So the way I do it clinically is I use transcutaneous auricular vagus nerve stimulation, which basically means I don't have them here, but they're basically little clips that go into your ear. Yeah. So this part of your ear here has basically, it's part of the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve also goes in through the mouth and it goes down in through to the viscera. And this is attached to what's called a TENS machine. And a TENS machine is transcutaneous electroneedling stimulation. So it just fires an electrical impulse. And then I have them on both ears because there's two vagus nerves, one left and one right.
Yeah.
And depending on the thing that's driving the problem, is it inflammatory based, is it brain chemistry based, or is it, you know, immune based? I will set the stimulator onto a frequency of hertz, so 2 hertz, 10 hertz, 20 hertz, or whatever, and then I'll just let them sort of drop into it, and usually they start to fall asleep, and you know, they start to release stuff, and it's like personal training for the vagus nerve, essentially. So it's like the more you do it, the better the nerve actually works by itself. So that's a very clinical way of doing it.
Is that a new technology?
No, it's just the TENS machines have been around for a long time in musculoskeletal therapy. Like they put the pads on you, and they basically stimulate muscles. They use them to fire muscles up, and they basically use them to, you know, get rid of pain. But there's just these ear clips are quite new, and the theories and the science behind it is probably only 5 years old. But there's a lot of papers, there's a lot of research on it. I've used it for a lot of different conditions, and like it's really good for mental health conditions such as anxiety, depression, trauma. But it's also really good for fibromyalgia, migraines, headaches, you know, Parkinson's, you know, neuropathies and stuff like that. So all sorts of different things. But on my page, I've also shown a few, you know, exercises which stimulate and innervate the ventral portion of the vagus nerve. So this is more related to, you know, working with getting your brain in a state where it's a bit calmer. So that's the one I sort of put up there. So you put your hands behind your head, and your head's still, and your eyes are just going to look to the side. You're just going to fix on a target, and you'll wait for like a big sigh that happens. It just happens automatically. And when that's happened, is actually your vagus nerve has got into a better position, and it's actually starting to work better.
So you put your hand on your neck like this.
Yep.
Then you turn your eyes to the left.
Yeah, right or left. Just stay there. And what will happen is you'll either sigh, yawn, or swallow. Just wait for it. It can usually takes a little bit at first.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah.
And then to the left, and then to the right.
Did you sigh, yawn, or swallow?
I sighed.
Beautiful. You're a sigher. I'm a sigher. Some people yawn, and some people just do a little swallow. But they're all signs that the vagus nerve, and particularly the ventral vagus nerve. So wait till the other side does it, and just tell me how you feel after you've done that. I always notice a massive shift. You just biologically, you're in a better position. You're neurobiologically calmer. Okay, so check in with yourself now. Have you done both sides? How'd you go? Have you got a sigh both sides?
Yeah.
Notice the difference?
It feels very restful.
Yeah, it's very restful, and you're now in what I was talking about before when we had the 3 responses to stress. There's the freeze response, there's the fight-flight response, and then there's the socially engaged response. And you are now, right now, in that socially engaged response. That is how quickly and easy it is to create change in the nervous system. Yeah. So one of my other sayings, which I learned from another mentor I've had, goes by, change happens at the speed of the nervous system, which is very, very, very fast. So, or it doesn't happen as well. So sometimes you might do something and nothing happens, and all that means is that didn't work. Yeah. But in your case, you see how quickly that happens, that you get an instant response. And the more you do that over time, the more your brain, your vagus nerve will start to function better by itself. So if you do that daily, I always do that before bed, and it helps me sleep so much better. Doing that daily, remember, it's like daily habits, like it just starts to wire in, and it creates neuroplastic changes. So
Indeed.
The technology is all in the body. Like, the vagus nerve stimulator I'm talking about before, that really helps, and it particularly helps for getting the entire vagus nerve to work better. But the one you just did then is really powerful. It's really it really works. And we just tend to look at things that seem a bit simple as not that effective, but they are. So these are the sort of things I'd be giving to nearly everyone. And I use that even with athletes. So getting them to be able to recover better. They did exercise after, say, an interval or a circuit. Their body just starts to calm down a lot quicker. So it has multiple uses, but most of it is actually improving your brain's stress response. It's improving your heart rate variability as well. So that's the ability of that's basically the balance between your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system. You want that to be in a good, have a high heart rate variability. So, you do that exercise, you take your heart rate variability, and then you do that exercise, and then, people are seeing like instant changes on a heart rate variability after doing that exercise. So, yeah.
So this is like a strategy that one can use to help, rather than going for the top-down therapy. You can actually start to expand the body's capacity to deal with, to offload some of the stress and deal with it in a much more healthier way. Improve the organs and the nervous system, the transmission of information from the organs to the brain, and
the whole thing. Yeah.
The whole thing.
There's a lot of different ways we can provide healthy inputs into the nervous system. I just think like we have a nervous system, and it's receiving inputs, it's integrating the inputs, and then it's creating an output. Okay, so we have the detrimental inputs and we have positive inputs. And what you just did then was a positive input, and you saw the result. The output was you feel calmer. And so when we go through trauma, that's a detrimental input, and the output is we feel worse. When we are fatigued and we work too hard and we don't get enough rest, it's consistent, like too much input. The output is fatigue. Yeah, it's almost like a computer in that way. So we have to make sure that we have relevant input, and then we're not going too hard, too fast, and it's the right dose of input. And also, if our brain's integration systems are good, then we'll actually be able to perceive the inputs. So some people are actually receiving good inputs, and we all know this, but they're still not responding, and it's because this guy is still under threat. So it's like you see people who are, they eat really well, but it doesn't do anything for them. They don't get better. And that's usually, like, for instance, they eat really well, and usually means their digestion is, I'm just going to a physical condition here, but usually it means that they've got good inputs, they're eating quite healthy, but it's still not working for them. And that's usually because their gut's not working properly. And usually their gut's not working properly because their brain's not working properly. And do they have psychological stress, or do they have an underlying traumatic brain injury or something like that? Yeah, you see how it all sort of wraps around. So, childhood development. So have we spoken enough about how childhood development impacts brain response to trauma? Does anyone have any questions about that that they want answered, do you reckon? What do you reckon, Kola?
I've not seen any question yet comes through. Okay. Yeah. What positive inputs would you recommend to help you overcome fear? So instead of freezing, fleeing, you approach uncertainty with confidence and engage productivity. That is from Senyeme, something like that.
Yeah, so a positive input is the one, I don't know if you were watching about a minute or so ago, where we had this one, we had your hands interlocked behind your head was still. The only time I would say don't do this is if you have visual issues, and you just look to the side and you wait for your body to sigh, yawn or swallow, and then you do it on the other side and you wait for a response to a sigh, yawn or swallow. That is probably the most direct input. It's extremely direct right into the brain, so it's going to actually make your brain feel calmer, and the more you do it over time, it's going to improve your brain's ability to feel calmer. So you don't have to try and think harder. You shouldn't have to try and think harder. It should be working for you. Does that make sense? Now there's definitely other strategies we can do, but that definitely does dampen down the fear response. So fear comes from uncertainty, it comes from safety, and the feelings of uncertainty and safety can be coming from the outside or the inside. And that drill just there, which is actually on my page, if you want to have a look at it, I've got a whole lecture on it. I wouldn't put anything up there that I wouldn't recommend anything that I don't think is really powerful, because I've learned thousands of things, and that is literally one of the best things I've ever learned. Doing that consistently over time. I mean, obviously breathing, breathing exercises. In terms of, it's almost you want to create positive inputs consistently over time. Consistently over time, and like to create neuroplastic changes, so your brain becomes more wired to be safe rather than to be in a fear response. And that depends on person to person how long that's going to take. And you might need to go see a specific practitioner who can actually work through specific, like there might be a specific trauma or traumas that you need to work through. If you need help with me, directing you to those types of practitioners, I know a lot of them worldwide, so I can help you out with that. But it's about providing good positive inputs consistently over time. That's just one of them. There are more. If you want to know more, just let me know. Hopefully that answers a little bit. But anything can be, for instance, another good input can be literally spending time in nature, going for a 5-hour walk in the bush. That's a massive positive input. Like, that's a huge input. If you go for a 5-hour walk in the bush with no phone, 5 hours later, your brain chemistry has changed. So you're able to process things a lot better. Doing earthing.
Sorry, everyone. That was a bit of a glitch.
There's more we can do with this, guys, too. There's more to unpack, and there's so many different facets and the components of this sort of type of work. There you go.
Yeah, I think there's a lot about top-down and bottom-up approach to trauma. I think maybe our next live show, and I know you've talked a lot about this, to be a different bottom-up approach to different, trauma histories or trauma disorders.
Mm-hmm.
And, the different approach that you've seen in your clinical work or that is possible to help people with, in terms of people with different, whether it's attachment, representation, orientation. And I know many of these are to do with the nervous system's response to, what is happening, plus the history of the person. They are where they are mostly in the nervous system, their default system. I like to explore more of that, but mainly coming back to the bottom-up approach to trauma and really expanding on the touch strategies, and the biological. And I know you've talked a lot about this all day. The brain and the organs of the body. How the organs of the body, the gut, communicate information to the brain, and how we can improve that. And I know you've mentioned all of that, but it's really interesting information that people need to get, that the more information we can make available in our body to the brain, the more the brain can respond to make us feel safer, exactly. And if the brain is picking up on from the body, if the brain is picking up that, the environment, or whether if there is a trauma history of injury, that people are orientated towards danger all the time.
Yes.
So what happens if somebody is always in the danger neuroception all the time? So, and the brain just consistently alarming. How does the person get a break from that? Or recognize?
What you're describing is most people on the planet.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so everyone's always reacting, and it's happening at a subconscious level. And the brain is always, it doesn't really care whether it's a psychological threat or it's a physical threat. It determines them as the same thing. So it will create strategies in order to deal with threats, so it can flee to safety. And the more this happens, the more the brain is wired to be in this state. So some of the strategies we've already discussed, which is vagus nerve therapy, breathing, touch therapy, they're actual valid interventions into getting the brain to start to shift out of that response. So, people have a trauma or a traumatic memory, but is it because the memory driving it, or is it that they were already triggered and then that memory was the thing that tipped them over the edge? Or is it it really does depend on the person. So they might have already had low levels of inflammation in their body anyway, so they had a lower response to stress, or it really is individual. But most people are in that state, and the brain is always trying to keep you in as safe a spot as possible. And so, how do we do that? Vagus nerve stimulation,
Indeed.
breathing, movement, sleep. Just sleep by itself is going to give your brain safety. It's going to in sleep we process this stuff psychologically. So
even people who are alarmed all the time, who are in danger zone all the time, when they sleep, they don't really sleep, do they? They either oversleep or have insomnia.
Yeah. So they might have what's called, they could have a few things causing that. They could have their reticular activating system is wound up too high, so their arousal system is on. So that needs to be calmed down. There's various processes. That's why I talk about GABA. So if you put magnesium and zinc in your diet, that tends to produce more GABA, which winds down the reticular activating system. But also they could be, for instance, they could be not sleeping properly because this is not happening at the moment, but it's like they've been traveling a lot, and that creates physiological stress, and their body might be on a different time zone, so they're not actually getting the proper rest. Or it could be the actual psychological trauma itself. So in that case, they need to go to some therapist or therapy that enables them to release the trauma from the body. It needs to be released from the body. Yeah. And then the mind process it better. So that's what I've basically kitted out my clinic to be, is ability to interact with the body and the mind, to be able to pull out the stress out of the bucket and integrate that person better, so they can move towards full health. Okay.
So, and people, for example, in talk therapy, there's a lot of different, labels. For example, people who have a very powerful inner critic.
Yep.
Who have a very domineering, this. Sorry.
That's a liver issue. The liver.
So rather than just doing talk therapy, where you give people, your inner critic and some self-validation, which I think all of these things, when you're dealing with somebody who is traumatized, who is a trauma personality, they don't want to know all of that. They cannot handle these cognitive.
Yeah.
Sorry?
They're not safe enough, are they?
No.
Yeah. So they need to, I was very lucky to be trained this way, because I can tell just by the way someone moves and how they're talking, whether they're in that traumatic state, they're in that fight, flight, or that freeze state. So usually what will happen if I see someone, they say, I've got anxiety and I would like to get better because of anxiety, and I see that they're in this threat response, what in my head I always say is, I am just going to work on calming their brain down for around 5 to 10 sessions. I'm not even going to talk to them. We're going to say, hello, how's this, how's that, but we're not going to go in and try and work stuff out. And then usually 5, 10 sessions later, because their brain's working a bit better, they're less stressed, their brain's already started to process things. So then talk therapy is much more effective, because
Absolutely.
Their brain is calmer. So this is where the health system needs to be better, and it needs to be able have people who do that, and then there needs to be a continuum of, you know, if someone's in trauma, they need to go and get the right therapies, calm the brain down, calm the nervous system down, and then the talk therapy will be a better therapy. It's always getting the right dose at the right time with the right people.
Indeed.
Anyway, man, I think, are we heading off soon, or like? I think
Absolutely,
what
absolutely.
to see is
Absolutely. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you in a different, even though we've been talking for the last 2 weeks, but doing this interview, you know, I think I am much more focused and I'm much more directive, and I've really enjoyed it a lot. Yeah, I've really enjoyed it.
Okay, so please share more about the liver in relation to the inner critic. Okay. So all organs have, you know, this goes back to Chinese medicine a little bit. So I've studied a lot of that as well. All the organ systems have emotions. And even in other systems outside of Chinese medicine, they've started to look at this a bit more. But the liver organ is related to the emotion of anger. So anger and stress and anger will affect the liver, and the liver is the major detox organ in the body physiologically and psychologically. So we usually get angry when we feel like we have no choice. Yeah. And anger is usually a result of not accepting self. And we will not accept ourselves when we feel rejected. Okay. And if we're not accepting ourselves, we reject ourselves. So the inner critic is that rejecter. Okay, the inner critic is the editor. The liver is the editor. You know, the guy that's the one's always saying, "Oh, that's not good enough." This, that, and the other. That is kind of the psychology of the liver. So
Really,
what could cause that is physiological, like the liver being under too much physical stress, which will actually give you the psychology, or it could be just that psychology itself giving liver issues. It's always a bi-directional feedback.
absolutely.
So
it's always helpful to deal with the biology force, isn't it?
Pardon? Yeah.
It's always very helpful to deal with to help the biology.
Yeah,
to relieve the stress.
A lot of times, it's always about chicken or the egg, working out which is the right thing for that person. But yeah, the inner critic is definitely a liver thing, because the liver is related to the wood element, and the wood element's all about being perfect and being the most acceptable, doing things really well, and you know, sometimes if you're always trying to do things perfectly, you're not accepting where you are, so you're always criticizing either yourself or others. Does that make sense? Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I love. Yeah. So liver.
Yeah,
I mean,
that is from Australia actually. That's a connected craniosacral puzzle from Australia.
Yeah, I'll search sure.
Cool. Thank you very much, Nick. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, mate.
And yeah, I'm going to watch this video and then make some plan for our next live show. I think right now, from what I'm feeling, I think we're going to delve more into some of these organs and how they can create psychological problem. And I know it's bidirectional, but I haven't experienced with someone who is traumatized. I know that talk therapy it just doesn't cost anything at all.
Sometimes,
sometimes it does, but at the beginning it doesn't.
Yeah.
At the beginning, it is great, but when the body is closed, there's no amount of talk therapy. You can get it to open.
It's perfectly explanation there. What we could also do is open up a question to the people who were on this call, like what would they like more of to hear, and we can frame it around that as well.
That'd be great. I'll do that as well. I'll do that.
Forever. I could do this forever.
Sorry?
I could do this.
I know. I feel that. I feel that. Cool. Thank you very much, Dr. Nick Moss. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wealth of knowledge and experience and training. Thank you.
Thank you, brother.
It's been a pleasure.
Awesome,
it's been a pleasure to.
I think you could do this for a living.
I will. I'm feeling more. Thank you for your encouragement. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes.
And thank you, everyone that tuned in. Thank you very much for taking the time. I know it's late, or you might be in some different places,
Indeed.
but thank you very much and for engaging.
See you
soon.
Have a great day.